Hi, welcome to Beyond the Oak Woodworking. My name is Jordan, and today I'm going to show you how I built this miter saw station that provides a ton of storage for your shop. I started on the floor and broke down the plywood sheets with my circular saw. Then I was able to move to the table saw and cut out what will be the exact dimensions for each piece of the cabinet, which are 2 side panels, 1 middle divider panel, 1 bottom panel, 1 rear panel, and 4 stretchers. Now, to be able to slide the rear panel into the cabinet, I needed to add a 1/4 inch groove to the 2 side panels, the bottom panel, and one of the top stretchers. So I set my table saw fence to 3/4 of an inch and lowered the blade to 1/4 of an inch. And since the blade is an 1/8 inch thick, I ran each board through the table saw twice, which gave me a 1/4 inch wide groove. Now the middle divider panel gets a few extra cuts compared to the 2 side panels. I removed 3/4 of an inch off the top and 1 inch off the back. I then measured out slots, which will be where the top stretchers will lie across, and cut those out with my jigsaw. After that, I was ready to work on assembling the cabinet. I decided not to get too fancy with this and to just use pocket hole screws. So I drilled out 4 pocket holes on each side of the bottom panel and 2 pocket holes on each end of all the stretchers. Now I could attach the side panels to the bottom and did this by applying a bead of glue and a clamp to ensure everything stayed flush while I drove in the pocket hole screws. Make sure when attaching these all the dados are in line with each other, and also be careful not to over torque the screws as they will strip out the holes in the wood. I then moved the cabinet to the floor and laid it in the face down position. Now I needed to add the middle divider panel. To ensure it is dead center, I cut out some spacer pieces. I then applied some glue and set it into place. I followed that with drilling some pilot holes in from the bottom panel with a countersink bit and came back adding the screws. After flipping the cabinet right side up, I could now install the top stretcher. I applied glue to each end and the middle divider slot and fastened it into the side panels with pocket screws. I also drove 2 screws down into the middle divider. Before installing the rear top stretcher, I slid the 1/4 inch rear panel down into the dado groove I cut out earlier. I then topped it off by adding the stretcher, which also had a dado groove with glue and screws. Don't worry about gluing the rear panel in the groove, as there is no need for that. The last step to building the cabinet box will be installing the back stretchers to the top and bottom. I first flipped the cabinet face down again and installed these with glue and pocket hole screws. I also joined the top and back stretchers with a few screws and repeated this step with the bottom panel and the bottom stretcher. These will add rigidity to the cabinet and keep it from racking. They will also provide a way to fasten the cabinets to the wall during the installation. And there is a 2-compartment cabinet. I repeated the same process and made another one. I also made a single compartment cabinet, which is the same process minus the middle divider. Now I needed to make the kick plate, so I ripped down some 3/4 inch plywood to 3 3/4 inches for the outer frame and 3 inches for the inner supports. I used pocket hole screws to assemble this as well. You see, I made the inner supports 3/4 of an inch shorter than the frame because I needed to make room for another piece of plywood to lay flat on top. I secured these pieces by countersinking pilot holes and driving in some screws. These pieces are important because they will provide a way for me to attach the cabinets to the kick plate later. I ended up making 2 of these to have enough room for all of the cabinets. Now, before moving everything into place, I needed to find the wall stud so I'll have something to mount the kick plate and cabinets to. So I grabbed my stud finder and ran down the wall, marking a line at each stud. After that, I was ready to move the kick plate into place. Now before adding the cabinets, the kick plate needs to be leveled. So I grabbed some shims and inserted them where needed. I also added a few where I had gaps along the wall. I then fastened the kick plate to the wall by driving screws through the shims and into the studs. Now that everything was level, I joined the two kick plates together with a few screws and then applied the plywood on top just like I did earlier. And after that, I went back and snapped off the excess of the shims with my hand. Okay, so now it was time to add the cabinets. I placed them on top of the kick plate and noticed I spaced one section with a sheet of plywood. That is where the miter saw will be. To attach the single cabinet to the double cabinet, I just added a couple of screws through the side panels. I then anchored the cabinets to the kick plate by screwing the bottom into those plywood pieces that are laying flat. And as expected, the cabinets didn't sit completely against the wall, so I added more shims to the top where the wall studs are. Then I drove some screws through the shims and into the studs, also going back snapping off the excess. When buying shims, I would avoid buying the cheap wood shims. I chose these breakaway shims and you can see how easy they are to work with. Okay, so now let's shift our focus over to building the doors and drawers. For the doors, I wanted to make them look like drawers, so I lowered my table saw blade to 1/4 of an inch and ran the door through the table 2 times per drawer outline. This gave me a nice reveal, and if in the future I'd like to remove the door and add drawers to that cabinet, then all I would have to do is cut these outlines all the way through to make the drawer fronts. This gives you a little bit of flexibility if you're not exactly sure what you need when building your miter saw station. Okay, so now I needed to install the hinges to the door. After marking where I wanted them, I grabbed a couple of clamps and my Craig hinge jig and drilled out the holes I needed with a Forstner bit. This jig also provides where to drill the pilot holes for the screws. Now I was able to place the hinges in the door and fasten them with 2 screws each. I then moved over to the cabinet and needed to install the mounting plates for the hinges. After doing a little bit of measuring, I installed the mounting plates to the inside of the cabinet with 2 screws each. And at this point, it was just a matter of snapping each component together and testing it out. And there you have a functional cabinet door. Now it was time to build the drawer boxes. So I returned to the table saw and ripped down all 4 sides of the box. I followed that with installing a dado blade so I could add a groove for the drawer bottom to fit into. After setting the fence to 1/4 of an inch and the blade height to 3/8 of an inch, I ran all 4 sides to the table saw again. I then replaced my regular table saw blade and broke down a 1/2 inch sheet of plywood to make the drawer bottoms. Now I have all 5 pieces to make a drawer box. Assembling this is pretty easy. I just set the bottom piece in the grooves, applied some glue, and shot a few finish nails at each joint. This will provide plenty of strength as the nails are in the opposite direction of the pulling motion when opening the drawer. Of course, there are other ways to make drawers, but for the sake of a shop project, there is no need to go high class. To install the drawer slides, I used a 3/4 inch scrap piece of plywood for a spacer. I just set the slide right on top and fastened the screws to the side of the cabinet. Once I had both slides installed, I just sat the drawer box on top of the plywood spacers and fastened the slides with the screws. I repeated this same process by placing the spacers on top of the drawers I had just finished installing. If you are interested in using these same drawer slides, I will leave a link for them in the video description. For the drawer fronts, I used a jig which can measure out and center the holes evenly for whatever size drawer pull you choose. To attach the drawer fronts to the drawer boxes, I needed to match the same spacing as the door I already installed. So I used some playing cards for the spacing and shot 2 screws through the front where I just drilled the holes for the drawer pull. I was then able to open the drawer and shoot 2 screws from the inside of the box into the drawer front. I followed that by removing the 2 screws on the front and finished drilling the holes all the way through so I can install the drawer pull hardware. At this point, now is a good time to apply a finish to the doors and drawer fronts. I applied some wood stain and a few coats of polyurethane to provide some protection for the wood. Now I needed to make basically a shelf for the miter saw to sit on. So I measured the height while sitting on the plywood I'll be using for the shelf. I then took that measurement and marked a couple of lines on the cabinet sides. I then came back with a couple of shelf cleats and lined up the top of the cleats to the marked lines. And after that, I fastened them with screws. Before installing all of the countertops, I wanted to beef up the edges a little. While the countertops are only 3/4 of an inch thick, I added another small piece of 3/4 inch plywood to the edge with glue and brad nails. I followed that by adding a protective border around the top. I mitered these pieces at 45 degrees and also fastened them with glue and brad nails. Now I have a final edge reveal of 1.5 inches thick. After that, I needed to add something to protect the top, so I chose laminate. So I rolled it out, and after measuring out the sections I needed, I began scoring it with a scoring knife. I then folded it over until it snapped at the seam I just scored. Now, before applying contact cement, I put on my respirator and opened some doors for ventilation as contact cement fumes are very strong. I used a foam roller and applied 2 coats of the contact cement to the laminate and 2 coats to the countertops. After the 2 surfaces had dried, I placed out a few pieces of scrap wood to keep the surfaces separated while I set the laminate on top. After double checking the alignment, I began setting the sheet by starting in the middle and working my way toward the edges, pulling out the sticks and running my hand over the top. I followed that up by using a J-roller hitting every single inch on the top. This tool helps by removing air pockets and will ensure a strong bond between the 2 surfaces. I then went around the top with my router and a chamfer bit to soften the sharp edges. By doing this, it will also help prevent the laminate from chipping on the edge. Now it was time to start installing the tops. I started with the saw shelf. I drilled a few pilot holes just above the cleats and slid the shelf in and then drove screws through the holes and into the side of the plywood shelf. For the rest of the tops, I drilled pilot holes into the top stretchers of the cabinets. I then slid the top into place and simply drove screws in from underneath. After getting all of the tops installed, I wanted to add a stop block for the miter saw. And a T-track is great for this very purpose. To groove out a spot for the T-track, I clamped down a sheet of plywood to provide a straight edge. I then used a straight bit in my router and carefully grooved out a slot. After that, I slid the miter saw back into place, making sure the fence is in line with the groove I just routed. I then began anchoring it down by drilling some pilot holes and followed with 4 screws. Now I could install the T-track. After setting it in the groove with a snug fit, I began drilling some pilot holes and then came back and inserted all of the screws. Now the T-track I chose to use has a slot in it that provides room for an adhesive measuring tape. Before applying the tape, I needed to find the saw blade's reference line. So I just grabbed a scrap piece of laminate and taped it to the saw. After cutting with the saw, now I know exactly where the cut line is. I then lined up the tape to the edge of the scrap laminate and applied it along the T-track, pressing down firmly with my finger, ensuring a good adhesion. After that, I finished up by snipping off the excess at each end. For the stop block itself, I drilled a hole in the center of a scrap piece of wood and inserted a knob and a bolt designed for T-track and began testing it out. I was very happy with how well it held its position on the track. And with that, the miter saw station was finished, and it's a great feeling to complete a project like this. I hope this video gives you a few ideas on how you would like to design your own miter saw station. But if you want to build this one, then check out the video description, as I have provided build plans for this station as well as all the supplies I used in this video. Hey, I hope you enjoyed the video, and the Bible verse I'll be reading for this video will be from Proverbs chapter 3 verses 5 and 6. And it says here, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not depend on your own understanding. Seek His will in all you do, and He will show you which path to take." Thanks again for watching.